book blurb, which I know all about book blurbs, but this is what it says. Demoralised, privatised, despised by the public, disdained by politicians, demonised by the press. This is what has become of Britain's public services, which only a generation ago were highly regarded and held in affection both at home and abroad. Tales of public service by people working both inside and outside the public sector are aired in a new book, which Jenny has edited and Dan is one of the contributors to. And Jenny has also contributed to. These people share an allegiance to the values and purpose of working for the common good and an enthusiasm for getting things right. Public service on the brink.
Thank you. Thank you, Pam. It's very nice to see you all. So I'm talking first, and then Dan is going to talk a little bit about the press treatment of the public sector, which is John Whiting, who's a guest of ours tonight, who's offered very kindly, for our sake rather than his sake, to record the programme. He mentioned to Dan what a very powerful piece Dan's is. And if I remember, I did ask him to do it.
You did indeed, yeah.
But I met Dan, actually, surprisingly, when I was putting together my first book. And I brought copies of both here. And shall I wait for this lady to come?
It's the foliage.
Yes. I'll only mention my first book briefly because it was really how I got into my second book. My first book is called What It Feels Like to Be Me, and it was based on a question that came into my mind, or an interest that came into my mind, that we don't actually know what it's like to be somebody else. We'll never know what it's like to be anybody else. And I read a wonderful piece by John Updike, I don't know if you know the novelist John Updike, called On Being a Self Forever, in his memoir called Self-Consciousness. And I'd had the idea, before him, I'd had the idea of this book in my 20s, and when I read his piece I realised that it was very ripe for good writing and interesting writing. Of course, none of us could write like he did. But he tried to describe just what being John Updike was like. The quiet moments, the moments in the middle of the night, the things you think about when you walk down the road, the internal life. So not necessarily good things or bad things, just what it was like. And I got an age range from a young woman to an elderly woman to write for the book. I wanted all ages, but you'd be interested to hear that the largest single group was middle-aged men. So I asked 20 people, and I must have asked 25 people to get an equal number, and I got 13 men and 7 women. And that's contrary to what most people would have expected. So there's an awful lot of middle-aged angst in there. Anyway, I loved doing that book, and Dan was one of the many people who interviewed me about it, and I tried to explain an idea which isn't an easy one to explain. And somebody once said to me, why did you get such a lot of insecure people to write for you? And I said, people are insecure when you ask them. And that gave me the idea that I can get people to write. That seems to be my great strength in life, to get other people to write, because I've got other people to write for that. And actually Jonathan Miller did the foreword for that book. And I was out having lunch with a friend of mine who worked on something called New Deal for Communities. I don't know if you've heard of that. It was a good Labour Party initiative to improve the urban design of inner cities. And I'd been in the revenue then for 35 years, or nearly that. And it was only meeting her that made me realise that I'd been disliking but ignoring for probably 10 years, probably from the probably from the mid-80s, ignoring a pattern of madness within the department. The pattern of madness consisted of downgrading the actual work we were doing, tax law in my case, and turning the institution into a continual self-examination of what the purpose of our job was, restructuring, initiatives, targets. When I saw Liz Kessler's distress about the fact that she couldn't do what she wanted to do, she was told things like, it doesn't matter what you do, you just have to have an audit trail. And increasingly she was managed out of existence. In fact, the New Deal was a failure. So here I thought, oh, well, a book again. Because I realised then that everybody I talked to in the public sector was describing something very similar. And I'll tell you a little bit more now about what the book is about. But just to tell you what the book covers, I managed to get somebody to write about school education, somebody about universities, Professor Wiggins, who's a moral philosopher, and also very jovial and funny in character. I got a very powerful contributor on the NHS called Professor Joe Edwards, and I'll quote him later. A contributor wrote about the railway privatisation. Another one on PFI, you know what I mean by PFI? Public Finance Initiative, and on consultants. Dan's wonderful sister Rebecca wrote about legal aid, which I thought was almost the most important chapter. She had to try and explain how that fits into the public sector, because in my view it's something for the public, and it couldn't be more important and more under attack at the moment. We had a piece on local government by an academic called Ursula Murray. We had Liz Kessler on inner city renewal. We had Dan on the press. And then we had two rather big names as well, even bigger names than us. We had Mark Sawatka, who's the General Secretary for the Public and Civil Service Union, who wrote not about union, but about his enormous affection for, belief in, passion for, if you like, for the Department of Health and Social Security that he used to work for. And he used to be an old-fashioned, he used to work in a job office, they're called, an unemployment office, where they sat down with people until they discovered what the person's problem was, and they spent time with them. I'll be talking about that. And finally, on big names, we had somebody called Sir Roderick Braithwaite, retired ambassador from Moscow, who writes about the Foreign Office. He came back from Moscow. I have to admit, it's a family connection again. He's a friend of my sister Tamara, my late sister, but I've known him for a long time. He came back from Moscow to work in the Foreign Office as a civil servant, and he couldn't stand it. And a very famous ambassador, whose name I've forgotten, Sir Ivor somebody or other, wrote a valedictory when he was finished as ambassador to Rome. It's in the book. I don't know if you know what valedictories are, but they are what an ambassador writes at the very end of their term as an ambassador. They describe their experience, and they're allowed to write what they really feel. You know, I don't like the Poles. You know, they're allowed to put or whatever. They're allowed to write stuff you're not supposed to write. Well, he didn't have an attack, and of course it's inappropriate, but he didn't have an attack on the people he'd been working with, the Italians. He wrote an attack on the consultants' languages he'd been subject for many years. And I'm afraid that Gordon Brown not only would not have this piece published, I believe he abolished valedictories from that day, which is a disturbing story. So that's who my contributors are. I wrote about HMRC, which I'm going to talk a lot about, the old Inland Revenue. The question of the book, to me, perhaps it emerged really after. The first question was, why are we all putting up with an uncomfortable, unpleasant nonsense at work? And why aren't we protecting the public services verbally and vocally? But then, of course, I began to think, as I'll explain now, that there's a scary connection between what was going on, I'll broadly call it managerialism, and privatisation. The two are very connected. So I think the question of the book is what lies behind the managerialism, which I'll try to define, or to get defined in my conversation, I think, and the creeping privatisation, the creeping denigration of public service, and it being compared to its disfavour with all forms of private service. I have to say I'm not against private enterprise. I've worked, since I left the Revenue, I've been working in my husband's publishing company, and I've learned a lot about the fact that people in a small publishing company are not expected to go off for 4 days courses of self-analysis. You know, they're supposed to get on with the work, and there's a lot to be said for the private motive, and I'll mention that in a minute. So the blurb that Pam read out, I can't remember, I don't know who wrote that, the publisher, and I completely agree with it, but this was my blurb, and is also on it. And this is what I sent to all my contributors. I wrote this. I know what my job is, and I want to do it as well as I can. Indeed, I would love my work if I could get 1 day's peace to get on with it. But I'm beset at every turn by unintelligible, time-wasting and fruitless management initiatives, constant change, ill-judged targets, wrong-headed commercial examples, and continuous and misguided restructuring. I have to watch as instead of my customers, actually patients, pupils, taxpayers, getting a better deal from me, the only beneficiaries seem to be those who can lobby for special treatment. There was an advert in The Guardian early this month somebody called Mike Leftwich, I think he was called, and if anyone noticed, he took a whole page where he described very similarly to my book the things that he thought were wrong in public service, but he also talked about the bullying of public servants. And I think it depends really where you are, what kind of position you have. But I think undoubtedly that there has been much greater turnover in all areas of public service. And watching the tendency in the NHS and elsewhere to stifle whistleblowers, there was a frightening element of tyranny. Another quote. This is by one, I don't think anyone came across the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. I know you will have done if you worked with Revenue. The Office of Parliamentary Counsel are the kind of poshest government lawyers in a way, who actually write legislation. And I worked with one in one of my jobs called the Tax Law Rewrite. And just in case anyone thinks this book is full of lefties, he's actually quite conservative. But our view on the world was very similar. And this is what he wrote. The current vogue appears to involve replacing the oxygen of individuality with the carbon monoxide of conformity. It's like having gone to sleep in the promised land and woken up in captivity in Egypt. It's no consolation to be told it had been done on the basis of the best possible management consultancy advice. All right, for one other sort of quote, and then I'm going to talk a bit more about the content. But I saw a friend today who works for HMRC, the old Inland Revenue, and I was talking about courses. Well, she just does 2 days a week now, and obviously those 2 days are crucial. And she's doing work with some very big companies, it's extremely complicated technical stuff. But when I saw her, she said, oh dear, I've got to do a self-analysis, talking about that. I've got to look at my compliance skills for a 2-day course next week. I've got to self-assess. And I just had a quick look, you'll get me into trouble, but I had a quick look, self-assess my strengths and weaknesses, working issues in a disciplined way. Now I don't know if anyone here disagrees, I would doubt that a single one of these courses adds any difference to the way people work. When we first joined the department, and I loved it, and I certainly want to talk a bit about that, but when I first joined the department, we all knew what our job was. We were graduate entrants like I was, and there were people who come up through the grades, from whom we learnt a tremendous amount, who became tax inspectors, and we knew that our job was to help people who were what's now called compliant, people who wanted to pay tax, people who came to the counter in those days, to be hard on people who tried to avoid or evade tax, and generally to be professional. Well, since then, there's been, I don't know how many consultancy advice forums and meetings and initiatives where we discuss what our purpose is. Is this old-fashioned middle-age thinking? Well, luckily I've got people like Dan on board, and 2 or 3 young contributors, but what is alarming is that I think that people in post nowadays are much more nervous than we all used to be, and much more careful about towing the line. And I've seen this with young colleagues at work. I mean, Professor Joe Edwards, who writes about the NHS, he actually, and I think his piece is remarkable, but anyway, he talks about people sucked into the systems as being toadies. And I think that's a critical word, and I think some people one has to call toadies, but there's an awful lot of others who are just nervous of speaking up. But it is a phenomenon that we've all seen. I mean, why do people pretend to believe in all this stuff? It's hard. I went to a conference once, which I walked straight out of, and I was the only one who did. It was one of these, and looking at what our purpose was, and we were given, it was in a posh hotel, goodness knows what it cost, and none of us were doing any work for that whole day, and we were given these coloured pencils and bits of paper, and we were drawing pictures of where we fitted in. I mean, I just couldn't accept it. It's very long. So, what is the connection between privatisation and managerialism? I don't think we've really, or where does it all come? I don't think we got to the bottom. I remember when I was putting the book together, quite a lot of people I knew said, oh, it's all Reagan and Thatcher's fault. I'm afraid it isn't as simple as that, and I don't quite know the answer. But we really have more people commenting on the phenomenon and perhaps finding an answer. But Mark Zawodka gave an interview after one of our talks, which was, I think, excellent. And he was asked, do you think that the commercial ethos that you describe was instituted in anticipation of privatisation? He'd been describing the way that the job offices, the job centres, had been restructured. And he said, I've no doubt that the cultural shift was a precursor to the privatisation that's happened. We're now seeing the final pieces of that jigsaw, not just in terms of services, but also in the attack on the terms and conditions of staff. So these things are interconnected. Privatisation is the real motivation behind changes that when they first came in 20 years ago might have seemed innocent, but you can now see them in a different context. So the dividing up, for example, of departments into different business streams, the separating off of different functions into different sections, which are made separate from each other, the creating of a service delivered through call centres rather than through public one-to-one interactions. These were clearly, in my view, designed to allow services to be privatised. What's so extraordinary to me about that particular area of the job centres is why the press and the public and governments of all parties are so very tough on failures of the public service. Often they should be tough, but so very not tough. They're very lax on private side disasters. So you probably all have been noticed, I don't know whether you follow the story, about the very poor success rate or failure rate of the work programme, the current work programme. Well, that, recently, the report in February, only 3.6% benefit claimants were successfully placed for 6 months or more, and that, as was publicly and widely reported, was less than had been expected if no scheme had been set up at all. But actually, the contracts were renewed. And Today had a very good item on it, around that time, 22nd February, where it compared the numbers of cases that a caseworker used to work. In the old Mark Sawatka days, 35 people per caseworker. Now, 250 per caseworker. So why is the public... What's behind all this? Well, I'd love to hear what you all think what's behind it, and I'll try and see if there's any other answers, but I can only, in a heartfelt way, describe my own experience, and I don't know whether the gentleman at the back who worked for the revenue would have any of this to best. But the extraordinary thing to my friends and relations, particularly perhaps my relations, because not many Jews joined the department in my day, I absolutely loved the revenue when I joined it. And it's quite common to get public servants talking with that level of effusion, enthusiasm. I loved it. And I've been rather a rebel at school and university. But one of the reasons I loved working for the revenue was because of that point. I knew what the purpose was from the moment I walked through the door. Originally, I wasn't going to write about the revenue. I was just going to write an introduction. But the friend of mine who was going to write, he decided to stay on the department. I retired a bit early because of the book, because our union, the First Division Association, said that I was doing, they were comfortable with my piece and the book, but they said it would have gone, if I stayed in the department, communications department of the revenue would have wanted to see it and we'd have never got it out. So basically I decided to retire, but my friend Jim didn't. So what I did, I had to do in rather last minute, was absorb his stuff into my introduction and quoted him. But what's extraordinary to me was that his background, he's what I call a bluff Liverpudlian. And he doesn't go in for hyperbole. But he told me, and that's how he wrote his piece to start with, and I couldn't echo that one quite, because he said watching the department disintegrate was as painful in its way than the divorce he'd been through in his marriage. That's a comparison he made. And somebody, a reader who's read this book just recently, said to me he sensed my sadness in that chapter. I think I was very sad, and by the end I'm afraid I wasn't sad anymore, I was just fed up. So that's what happens, I think. But to start with, we were taught a lot of tax law, we were trusted, there was no bonus culture, there was competition, but it's a large intake so that everybody could get on, we didn't have to kind of beat other people. And we interacted with the public. I mean, at those days, as I say, you could come into the counter of a tax office and the tax inspector would go and talk to them. Now, you may have noticed, I don't know if you have, that the revenue is now closing its inquiry offices. So you can only contact the department by phone. We all know what that's like. But what's so very wicked, I think, is that before they closed inquiry offices, they actually took away the ability of people in the inquiry offices to look up somebody's computer records. So actually, when you went into an inquiry office, I learnt this to my cost, because I advised a friend to go to one office, all they could do was give you out leaflets. In the old days, they would phone through and sort that issue out. That had gone. So no wonder the numbers coming in dropped. And on the other hand, and I know most of you will have followed this, we've become a soft touch to business. That's not popular to say that. I mean, Margaret Hodge says it, as you all probably know. But I fear that's what's happened, and I think Private Eye has been remarkable in exposing some of this. And a lot of this, again, is the Labour government's fault. Well, it's not only the Labour government, but I don't know whether you picked up this sort of stuff, but Gordon Brown told the Revenue we must make UK PLC a good place to do business. That was the new language. Despite what I'm saying, I actually like working with businesses. I dealt with oil companies at one stage, and I enjoyed the relationship, and I enjoyed it when we could be sometimes not indiscreet, but actually very informal with each other. But this is something different. That was when we knew very much what our side was and what our role was. But I fear very much that the pressure from politicians and from businesses threatening to leave the country, which I have to say they hardly ever really do, has been too hard for the Revenue to stand up to, and it fits in with what's happening in the rest of public service. And one other rather technical point on this, I don't know if you've heard David Cameron or George Osborne boasting about the new general avoidance provision that they're bringing in. I don't know how much people have followed the issue of tax avoidance. Well, it's a sham. It was the advisors on the general anti-avoidance provision, known as a GAR or GAP, were solely private side tax avoidance specialists, advised on the legislation, not the Revenue. And the thing can be blown right through. It's actually, some people say, a charter for avoidance, because it only deals with the most intense, most distasteful, almost off the edge of legality. So obviously it's easier for me to talk about the Revenue than other departments. But what was noticeable in the book was the powerful feelings that other people had too. And I don't know whether there were maybe lots of other books like this, but I haven't heard of them. And I don't think public servants have really had much of a voice. They have a political voice, and Labour probably didn't notice that they lost their vote last time. Round about the election, I've got a statistic here somewhere, of the percentage of people who voted Labour within the public service in the 2009 or 2010 election, the last election. A small minority of public servants voted Labour. They used to be Labour voters. So it hasn't done Labour very well politically, but despite the political strength that public service might have, and the strength that the unions might have, and Dan will talk a little bit about where the unions don't have as much of a fair press as they should have, I don't think public servants are being listened to. The public, however, not the public service, but the public, almost universally, seem to want public services provided by state providers. Survey after survey of this shows, and that goes from right to left. And we saw that in the opposition to the new Health and Social Care Act. And of course, health, I remember this, my daughter's a doctor, a hospital doctor, so I hear a little bit about what's going on there, but at least the health service has got its protectors. My worry is, particularly for education, where school education, where I don't think there's a powerful enough, this is my experience, a powerful enough support group to support, for example, local authority role in schools. And now we have a particularly bad example, and I'll finish on this, locally in Barnet. I mean, you don't live in Barnet, but I do. And I don't know whether people have been following the One Barnet conversations. Huge-scale privatisation. Well, there's only one issue that I've taken up, or want to take up, so far, because I've been busy. And this is the plan that Barnet now has for disabled people. And I'm mentioning this because it's a wonderful, dreadful example of this combination of privatisation and mealy mouth gobbledygook. So, I don't know if people know about this, and I'm sure that the Camden New Journal has written it up, or Hammond High has. Well, there's something called Your Choice Barnet. Your Choice provides severely disabled people with their own budget and ownership of their personal budget. Well, friends of mine have a severely disabled son. He must be 43 or 4 now. In body, he's about a 6 or 7 year old. He'll never talk, he'll never walk. He's been looked after since he was an adult, in an extremely good residential home, and he's gone to a very nice day centre. Well, neither of these look as if they're going to be available much longer. And this is what Barnet Choice said about what they're doing. Right. North London adult social care organisation Your Choice Barnet has announced new plans to offer disabled people better value for money and more flexible services. The plan aims to reduce costs for specialist support and care for people with learning and physical disabilities as increasing numbers take control over their social care by choosing personal budgets. That's what Benji is going to do now. The efficiency proposals include a restructure of the Your Choice Barnet management team and some restructuring, that's always a dangerous word, of individual teams. The plans would lead to an overall reduction of 6.8 full-time equivalent posts. Other proposed changes, there's a little bit about where they're going to be, the buildings. This is the changes for staff. If you can imagine how well paid the staff are. The end of weekend and nighttime pay enhancements for staff to be replaced by a flat pay rate, so no more weekend money. The introduction of schemes to encourage greater use of volunteers for non-specialist tasks, and the introduction of more assistant support workers to provide non-complex support, such as personal care, so freeing up a smaller group of support workers to carry out more specialist work. What they're saying is they're going to get rid of specialist staff and bring in volunteers. Now, I was just asking my husband, the publisher, what would you feel like if somebody said to you, you don't need those trained editors and those trained marketing stuff, it'd be wonderful with just a few volunteers to take over. This is where, as I say, there's something deeply unfair, and more than that, because people's idea of fairness varies, something deeply illogical and inconsistent with the treatment of the public sector versus the private sector. Anyway, let me let Dan walk, and there are books for sale, and I'd love to get the discussion going later.
Good evening. Thanks, Jenny. Thank you. Thank you, everyone as well, for coming. I spoke here about, it must be about 8 years ago, and it's really nice to come back and see the place looking so wonderful, see Primrose Hill looking so beautiful, all the magnolias out. So thanks for coming this evening. As Jenny mentioned, we met a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, when she came into my office with her book, and I sat down and read it, and we ended up putting the world to rights. We had a couple of cups of tea on the sofa at the CNJ offices, on the sofa there, and I said I would very much like to write about the public sector. Now, how on earth am I qualified in any way to talk about the public sector? And I worked for a small local newspaper. Okay, I'll give you a little bit of background and then tell you a bit about my chapter. Before I worked for the New Journal, I worked at the Royal Free Hospital. I left school when I was 16, and I worked for 5 years in the NHS. There are 5 people in my life who I turn to if I need advice or help or a shoulder to cry on, and they're all public servants. My brother, my 2 sisters, and my mother and father. My brother's a teacher, my mum was a primary school teacher in Camden, my dad has been a university teacher, one of my sisters is a doctor, the other sister is a lawyer in a legal aid, well, in a community law centre in Brixton, and she has been so for 20 years. So, although that may not fit the archetypal role of a public servant, she certainly is a public servant. So, I've always had an idea that public service is something which is kind of something which should be celebrated and something wonderful, something amazing, and so I feel through working at the New Journal. Before I worked at the Journal, I worked at various national newspapers. I worked at the Evening Standard, Whisper at the Daily Telegraph for a little bit, and the Daily Mirror, and I was often surprised by newspaper reporters' attitudes to the public sector. And it got me thinking, and so I used that as the basis of the chapter for my chapter in this book, which, as I say, I'll talk you through. Okay, so what I decided to do was interview people who regularly feature in the pages of the press, public servants who newspapers hold to account. Now, I hope you all read the Camden Journal. You know, one of our big things is holding local authorities to account, making sure we're a voice for the voiceless. I get an awful lot of phone calls at the New Journal from people who perhaps have issues with dealing with public authorities and wonder if there's a wider story, whether it affects other people. So I'm aware that newspapers do have a role, obviously holding our public services to account. But I think there's almost blanket coverage amongst amongst the national press to not so much to hold public services to account, but to question them in a way that asks whether they should exist at all. Is it almost a default setting for journalists to say public service is bad, private sector is good? Now, whether that's because we've reached a kind of an epoch of Thatcherism, I don't know. But it was something I thought was interesting. So what I thought I'd do is, for my chapter, speak to public service and see what it's like to be on the other side of it. So I spoke to 5 different sets of public service. I spoke to some firemen I know, who all work for the FBU, sorry, all members of the FBU. Firemen who, if your house in Camden burns down, they'll be there within a couple of minutes. They're all based at Cambridge Town and Belsize Park. So I spoke to them. I spoke to members of Unison, who are all health workers, and asked them what it was like to be a member of Unison. I spoke to some social workers, and I spoke to the RMT, the Railway Maritime and Transport Union. And then finally I spoke to the president of the NUJ to ask why journalists didn't seem to do this. Now, to start with the fire brigade, when I spoke to firemen I knew, it had just been after the report into the 7/7 bombings had come out, and there were quite a few stories in the national papers which called individual firemen heroes. Okay, said, you know, they found individual stories, journalists had gone to the inquiry and found people who'd walked down railway tracks in King's Cross and dragged people out of burning tube trains. Which is their job, very brave, I don't think I could do it, an amazing thing to do, and they were portrayed individually as heroes. And in the same newspapers, on other pages, because they were members of the FBU and they were in a dispute with the GLA over changes to their rotas, they were portrayed as money grabbers. Why do you want your rota changed? You want your rota changed because you want to keep your second job so you can be a taximan during the day, drive a cab, and at night go and fight fires. Instead of the FBU stance, which was we don't want our rotas changed because at night there are worse fires, so we need to have a longer shift then, you know, without actually looking at the real reasons for the last fire brigade's dispute. None of the press were at all interested. They just wanted stories about firemen being money grabbers and looking for reasons to not to change their rotas. So it set me thinking, why do newspapers have a public debate in such a way that doesn't look at the real issues? So with healthcare workers, they said to me, you know, when things go wrong in the NHS, we hear about it. Fair enough. I mean, look at, for example, the Staffordshire Trust. It's great that newspapers have held the Staffordshire Health Authority to account. But when things go right, we don't hear about it at all. The NHS is a massive organisation which treats thousands of people a day, saves lives every single day. You don't read about it in the newspapers, but if something goes wrong, they're all over it like a rash. And they use it as a hammer to say the public sector is intrinsically a broken model. I looked at the RMT, and I also went on to look at social workers. Now, social workers I found particularly interesting because I think they've become the kind of favourite bogeyman of the nanny state. I mean, it's extraordinary what bad press they get. The social workers I spoke to said the press coverage of their work bears virtually no relation to the work they do. Okay, it ignores the fact that they have an extraordinarily hard job. They deal with the sharp end of social breakdowns on a daily basis. I was shown research that shows GPs reports that a lot of social workers suffer from a form of post-traumatic stress. They can stay in a job for 4 or 5 years, and after that they're burnt out. I mean, they are more likely to split up with their partners than other professionals. They find it almost impossible to leave the harrowing cases they deal with on a daily basis at the front door when they come home from work. And you can imagine how awful it must be. Be a social worker in Haringey with dealing with some of the poorest people in Britain who have absolutely terrible social problems. And in this era of spending cuts, the job's got a whole lot harder. The lack of resources, coupled with, it means their skills are needed more than ever, social workers get a terrible, terrible ride. So I went through some newspaper archives and wondered whether journalists might write about how hard it is to be a social worker and whether they have the tools at their disposal to do what sort of jobs they were doing. Not a word. I went through 10 years worth of newspaper reports and I couldn't find, and this is broadsheet as well as the tabloids, and I could not find one article that took to pieces the life of a social worker or the resources they had to hand. Instead, they were solely spoken about in a negative way. Now, do you remember the case of Baby P, as I say, in Haringey? I mean, awful, heartbreaking case. And this highlights how I feel the press often deals with public sector workers. Okay, did the newspaper coverage of that terrible, terrible tragedy talk at all about why, on a wider basis, why did the social workers fail that child? They didn't. They basically went off to Sharon Shoesmith, who was the head of Haringey's Adult and Social Care Department. They didn't talk about the lack of resources in Haringey. They just said she was rubbish at her job. They hounded her out of her job. They didn't ask about the tools she had to do her job properly or the people she was working with. And it went on to, in my mind, highlight quite a strange paradox, which is at the heart of reporting when it comes to social workers. I found some typical headlines. There was one which said, there was a headline that said, a mother had saved her family from the clutches of social workers because social workers had wrongly accused her of abuse when her baby was seriously ill. There was another one which said, social workers took my baby away for 11 months without a shred of evidence. These were headlines. So on one hand, you have appalling scandals caused by inept social workers, whereas on the other hand, if they don't do anything, they're damned. My archive brought up headlines that showed that if they fail to stop terrible things happening, they're incompetent, never do well, so they're directly responsible for children's misery. And then on the flip side, if they do step in, they're painted as do-gooding guardianistas who wreck happy family homes. Real strange paradox. I wondered why this might be. And as I said, when I spoke to social workers about this, they said it was really, really demoralising. You can imagine what it must be like to see your profession painted in this way, that whatever you do is wrong. And I was wondering, why would a well-educated journalist do this? Surely you enter journalism to kind of find truth. I mean, I always had this idea that being a journalist was like kind of being Robert Redford in the Watergate movie, you know? It's kind of, you want to uncover stuff and you kind of want to, bang the drum for truth and hold the trusty shield of fair play and all the rest of it. But no, apparently not. Apparently it's about headlines and it's about attacking the public sector. I thought it'd be interesting to look at the RMT as well, who crop up in, especially the tabloids, in the Mail, the Express and the Sun. And the Evening Standard as well. They're really seen as the bad guys. They're kind of taking the role the NUM used to have in the 80s. Bob Crow's the new Arthur Scargill. He's like a total bogeyman who journalists like to stick in the stocks and like throw rotten vegetables out on a regular basis. So I went to speak to his press officer, the bloke whose daily job is to deal with Bob Crow's like public image. I mean, he really earns his living. And he said to me that he has this arduous task of sort of rebutting stories every day, endless hostile noise. But what he really wants to do is talk about the work the RMT does. He wants to say the RMT is commissioned to report into rail safety, and we recommend A, B, C, D. He says that to every news desk in the country, never gets anything out of them. He says, I want to talk about why don't people use the trains and buses enough? Is it the buses aren't well managed and they don't stick to timetables? Why don't people get on the trains enough? Is it because the ticket prices are too expensive? These are issues that the RMT discuss at their conference. Have any of you seen stories about that in the press? Maybe rarely. Bob Crow, on the other hand, whatever he does, they leap all over it. I found a story about him going to a football match, and the Sun had a picture of him standing in a crowd, and they said, Stalinist union leader in foul-mouthed rant at a football match. And apparently, I spoke to his press officer about this, and apparently someone had scored a goal and he leapt to his feet and went, yeah, it's in there, sort of thing. and they went in the Sun that he was indulging some foul-mouthed rap. I mean, it gets worse. They found someone sent the Sun news desk a photograph of him in a restaurant in King's Cross. Their offices are in King's Cross, and at Christmas a couple of years ago, he took all his staff out for a meal, and it's a karaoke place. It's a Japanese restaurant, and they have a karaoke bar there. And someone said to him, "Bob, give us a song." And he was like, "Oh, yeah, you know, it's Christmas. I've had a couple of beers. I'm out with all my colleagues. Of course, I'll give you a song." He sang "Fly Me to the Moon," which I think is quite nice. And there was a photograph in the Sun the next day which said, "Union boss sings karaoke, ... while plotting travel chaos." just totally ridiculous. You know, it's just crazy. You know, the RMT get a particularly tough time, and I wonder why is that? Is it because they're quite a strong union? It's a very unionised area of still a very unionised area of British society. Transport, and I wonder whether it's because there's a feeling of maybe a threat from them, or I don't know. It's very, very hard to say, but the bottom line is the press do not hold the RMT account for the right reasons. They hold them to account for the wrong reasons. This bloke looks quite, he's bald head, it's muscly. The son went round his house with a double-decker bus and parked it across his front drive so he can get his car out. When he went to give him a taste of his own medicine, as they said in their headline, and when he kind of walked past them and walked to the tube station, I know a photographer who works there. They said the photographer was told to get the reporter to tread on his toes so they could get a picture of him scowling. I mean, this is just not holding the public sector to account at all. What is the motivation for this? Why is this? Now, I think it's perhaps too simplistic to state that all our main newspapers are owned by billionaire industrialists who have a neoliberal approach to state services. They champion lower taxes and smaller state services, and therefore try to win the argument by printing negative stories day after day to distort the truth about the performance of our public services. Papers obviously have to be a vital watchdog. We have to hold our public authorities and public services to account, but we also need to celebrate the work our public services do. There are a lot of really selfless individuals who work really, really hard in the public sector who don't get a fair crack of the whip. And it's quite heartbreaking that the playing field isn't level, that we don't hear of the successes of the doctors and nurses who work in the NHS, who work very long hours for frankly little pay compared to the skill set they might get in the private sector. It's heartbreaking to know that there are social workers who could actually do with a pat on the back sometimes from journalists, working in really, really hard conditions. It's heartbreaking to know that when they're, that our public transport system isn't properly scrutinised, so as the public we can make an informed decision about whether we should have a nationalised rail service or whether the private sector is actually doing a good job. I'd quite like to know. I'd like to be able to make that decision by being given the information at my, through my newspapers. And so really that's kind of what my chapter's about. As I say, I interviewed these five public sector workers, and I was quite shocked. I kind of had an intrinsic idea that this might be what it's like. When I did shifts at the Daily Telegraph, I felt a complete fish out of water. Take me home to the CNJ as quickly as possible, please. You've heard the conversations going on the news desk, and it did make me wonder why. I think one of the problems perhaps is the fact that most journalists look like me. They're all white blokes who've been to university. There's not the diversity within the press that perhaps might lead to a better understanding of what a more representative press. And one of the joys of working for the Camden New Journal is we have a very wide demographic. We write for everyone. It's the strength of being a free paper, and I think it was one of the reasons the New Journal, when it was started, it isn't paid for, is because everyone reads it. There are people who live in Primrose Hill and Hampstead and Highgate, you read it. There are people who live in Somers Town, Camden Town, and Kentish Town, you read it. Doesn't matter what your income is, it's picked up and maybe it's used to line your rabbit hutch, but it's also read before it goes in the Paris sort of thing. So it's one of the strengths of the CNJ, but I don't know. I mean, is it because journalists are too scared of what their editor wants, who's then scared of Rupert Murdoch standing behind him and breathing down his neck? I'm not sure, but I think it's really important for journalism to break the Oxbridge stranglehold, which paints our public servants in such a poor light. Obviously, things go wrong in the public sector. It's by its very nature, it's massive. You know, the NHS is the biggest employer in Europe. Of course, there are going to be things that go wrong, but I'd like to know about them in an intelligent way. I'd like to know about them so I can hold it to account properly. New journals, a community-owned, cooperatively run newspaper. Perhaps that's the model we should be looking for in the future. I don't know. Anyway, that's what my chapter's about, and I won't run for any longer. But thank you very, very much for having us.
That was very enlightening, absolutely amazing, revealing and thought-provoking.
Yeah,
so speak your mind.
Questions and yes. And we've got the books at cut down price, author's price rather than publisher's price. So I think I'll sit down, but do say, some people totally disagree with all that.
Yeah. I mean, what are your experiences? I mean, again, we all use public services. I do hear an awful lot of horror stories about Camden Council through my job. I rarely get people ringing me up and saying, Camden Council came round straight away and fixed my loo. It was great. But that's the nature of the job I work in. But I wondered what I'd love to hear what your experiences are, particularly of how maybe you think the press play a fair bat with public services, or have I got that wrong? Did I solely speak to people who have an axe to grind? I don't know. I mean, perhaps one of the questions I'd like to know is, has the idea of public service changed in the last 30 years? Again, my father was a national serviceman. You know, he did 4 years in the RAF. He then went into university teaching, and he's always thought that working for the state and for the good of others is the highest thing you can possibly do. That's what you should use your talents for. There are people I know who would say now, you know, the thing which motivates them is earning a nice wage packet, not using your skill set for the good of others. Is that something which perhaps has changed over the years? Is that something which is a recent development? I'm not sure people I know who are my age would ever consider working in the public sector because they know they can earn a fortune elsewhere. I don't know. Anyway, any questions?
John?
I think you have both done a brilliant job, and sitting here by the camera, I have had to stifle my spontaneous yeses along the way that I wanted to throw in. You both mentioned the question, the really important question of what has happened to the ethos of public service. Not just what has happened inside it, but what has happened in the outer environment that has put the pressure on public service and changed it from heroes to villains virtually. I want to recommend an extraordinary television documentary series by Adam Curtis, who is one of the greatest producers of documentaries ever. And it is a series which is available in its entirety on YouTube. It's called The Century of the Self.
So do you have a question, John?
No,
well, I want... No,
yes.
Questions are not necessary.
No, it's a very interesting one. And I think we still have a lot of questions as to what happened. And one thing I didn't mention, I don't know how relevant it is. Well, two things. One is I'd love to get other people's ideas about what I'm broadly calling managerialism. And why has there is no I know of no evidence that endlessly restructuring and renaming and rebranding and self-introspection actually works. But I don't know why the opposition to that has been impotent, doesn't prefer. The other question I want to know is why politicians of all parties have hidden, I think, or tried to hide the lack of a political agenda by talking about public service so-called reform. You get one in after another saying we're going to reform the public services. I'm all for reform, but I actually don't know what they mean. But they think they mean something that's politically popular. So these are the kind of questions we have. I think yes, let's hear.
Well, I'm afraid mine is a comment rather than a question.
Yes.
But you praised Margaret Hodge, and I think what the work she's doing in the committee at the moment, the Public Finance Committee, I think it is wonderful. Yeah. I knew her very well because I worked in Islington for a number of years when she was leading the council. Now, at the time, I'm just trying to get my dates right, but I suspect it would have been at the time when Foot was leader of the Labour Party.
Yes.
And she was New Labour before New Labour was called New Labour. I worked in the Central Policy Unit,
yes.
And she was, I would say, a bully to her top level council workers. She wanted reform. She wanted reform at any cost. She wanted private consultants brought in to manage that reform because she didn't trust her own workers. She felt they were too political. She felt they were too unionised. So I think she's had actually, I think what the work she's doing now is fantastic, but she was a very, very difficult person to work with when she was managing a very large budget.
I want to say a bit about it because I know her actually, so which is difficult for me, but politically I don't agree with her. And I don't think she's ever been a very political person. She's she's a doer. And on one of her committees, the public committee, she actually bullied extremely badly an HMRC lawyer who wasn't a tax lawyer, Anthony Glazy he was called. And I was, in fact, my first version of this speech, I criticised her, you know, so I know, and I know what you mean. So it's not a personal approval of her or not, although I know her personally, so as somebody I like her personally, but leaving aside personal. But I think what's worrying is that it's needed people like her, however, to uncover some of the, what I call corruption, but some of the serious malpractice, and one mark of how successful she's been is in the last month she's been severely criticised by both sides. So taxation brought out a piece saying that she's a twerp or something, and my union, I'm afraid, has attacked her for, you know, they say we're doing fantastically well on avoidance, and, you know, Vodafone didn't happen, the Starbucks didn't happen. So I'm worried, and I tell you who else is good, the Conservative, I won't remember his name, but there's another significant committee, which might consider civil service, who does extremely good work too. So this is people who politically I'm not agree with. But why do we need them? And then, for example, Margaret Hodge was one of the first critics of PFI, public finance. But if you notice, this Conservative government, coalition government, after criticising, brought it back in again. And I don't know if you know, the reason politicians like public finance initiative is the debt doesn't appear on their balance sheet. But I mean, public knows that, we know that. Why can't we get politicians? And the other big why can't I get politicians in my own party, I'm still a member of their party, or in any party, to show any great interest in this debate? It's really impossible. Yeah, impossible. So we need the public to speak up a little bit.
Again, I mean, just to go back to the chapter I wrote, I feel that I was surprised at having gone through, I went through 10 years of archives and 10 years of headlines looking for things about social workers, the RMT, the NHS, and I was surprised by the low level of intellectualisation when it looked at the issues of whether there was a default to say the public sector is inefficient and bad at its job, but didn't present any evidence as to why. Now, rather than saying the private sector works providing services much better because of A, B, C, D, and here's the evidence, it wasn't evidence-based journalism, which I found really quite strange. whether you're on the right or left, you should use evidence-based research to decide how you want your public services to run. Maybe you would find that it is more efficient to have a private consultant. Maybe you would. But I'd like to see the evidence, and I'd like journalists to report that evidence. And instead it seemed to be done very much just on rhetoric and personalisation. Again, attacking Bob Crow instead of asking what the RNT should do. Should rail workers, should tube drivers get a bonus over the Olympics? I mean, what sort of extra hours are they going to have to put in, and is it worth it? Instead, it was all personalised attacks, or if they were reported in a nice way, they were reported as individual heroes. The firemen I spoke to who were down at 7-7 said, we're trained to get people out burning things. Call us a hero if you want, but I was just doing my job. There doesn't need to be called heroes in the pages of papers. And again, as I say, they then felt very, very hard done by when they were going into industrial action about the changes to their rotas. And they said, the reason we're changing our rotas isn't because we want to have an extra day off to mow the lawn, or because we want to have a second job, which we're only doing because we don't get paid enough anyway. We don't want changes to our rotas because it's proved that house fires at night are worse because people are asleep, so the smoke gets due quicker. We need to have more people on work at night. It's not because we want to earn double pay, because we prefer working at night. I'd rather be at home in bed with my wife. I don't want to do work at night. And none of this came out in the press. And it did make me think that we are in an era where public service isn't celebrated perhaps as much as it should be.
Yeah, I think that's meaningful. I think we'll take in order. Elizabeth, Richard, then Dean Line, and Colin, and Val.
Well, I think the point about all that news and is really very interesting, because I think it has a tremendous effect on public opinion. Bias pushes it in its own negative direction. Issues that don't really deserve such a lot of publicity, like even the hacking thing or other scandals like that. But the question is, why is it? Are you pandering to the public? Because the public who loves dramas and murders and deaths and muggings and all the rest of it, even the CNJ isn't immune from that.
No, absolutely. I have to say, I should really give a disclaimer that I stand here, although I do obviously work for the CNJ, my views are of my own, and I can't really speak for all of my board colleagues. But very interesting to say, I once was a primary, I've done every job at the New Journal now. I'm from paperware, I started there when I was 12 years old. I used to deliver it, I really have done everything there. And I once was I did 3 or 4 years on the crime beat, and it was during a period of time, maybe about 10 years ago, there was a terrible crack cocaine epidemic in Camden Town. Really awful. And on a weekly basis, I go and meet police officers and they tell me about people being mugged or, awful stuff. And I come, and not quite a lot of violent crime related to drug abuse. And I come back to the newsroom and say, it's an absolutely horrendous story. There's a phrase in journalism, if it bleeds, it leads. Horrible. But it's like tickling the public. It's what people, there's an idea that that's what you want to hear. And I remember getting on a bus coming home from work after covering quite a harrowing court case and being quite upset by it. And one of my neighbours said, I don't like Kentish Town at night. And I thought to myself, I walk home every day, I live in this area, I've lived here all my life, I probably know half the young men walking down the street you might feel slightly intimidated by. And it might be my fault that you're feeling intimidated by this person, but looking at the crime statistics, chances of you being a victim of crime are 1 in a million. Yet you read your local paper and you're petrified. There's an air of responsibility. Of course, we have to ensure our newspaper is informative and also pampers in a way to what people want to read, but there has to be that responsibility, and it's very tricky for journalists to tread.
Well, why don't you have an issue for a section for positive news?
Yes.
We
Martin
tried to.
Bell did it many years ago.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yeah, absolutely. Page 3 of the New Journal generally has a smiley story. We always try and find a lost dog who's been returned rightfully to the same with NW5 or,
Yeah, we love it all. But now, Richard Simpson.
Yes, I wondered if you haven't really answered your own question about where managerialism comes from, but we might put it rather bluntly. Surely it's because we live in a very ineffective democracy. And the fundamental problem is that good public services need good accountability, and to have good accountability, that needs to be public and open. We have a House of Commons that is a really very deeply ineffectual, self-serving outfit from the point of view of many of us. And we don't really have mechanisms which enable our public services to be accountable in the way that they ought to be, and in which the press should really be a part, but not the only part, or not the effective part. And I think that surely managerialism has been brought in by government in order to be a substitute for democracy.
Yes,
because actually it removes, like the PFI, it removes it from straightforward public accountability.
And I'm just thinking of the philosopher, David Wiggins, he, sorry, it's not an answer to your question, but his version is totally different. He suggests that there's a belief now in kind of perfectibility. That, you know, there always, the problems you're describing, I think perhaps always, that's maybe wrong. I mean, maybe you think it was a better democracy earlier on. But the difference possibly now is that people think everything can be reduced to systems that can improve it. Instead of having the kind of correct political debate that I think you're talking about, which I want, there's an idea that there's a systematic change. You can somehow find a formulaic way.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's a very interesting idea. I mean, you will find ideas in that book which touch on that. But anyway.
I wonder, very briefly, I wonder whether partly that might be something to do with the makeup of the House of Commons, just to pick up on what you were saying a moment ago. If you look within, I don't know about the Conservative Party benches, but within the Labour Party benches, in the 50s and 60s, there would be shop stewards who worked in factories who would then, you know, go and work for their union, and then from there be co-opted to other, you'd have ward councillors who had, you know, done 10 years on, Frank Dobson, for example, was leader of Camden Council for 8, 9 years. And there was a grassroots approach to becoming an MP. There is now, for people of my generation, I know 5 or 6 MPs who've never actually done any other job. They've gone and worked at the age of 21. Now, they've done a politics degree, and then at the age of 21, they've gone into maybe doing PR or some form of job within the House of Commons. They've gone and worked for the Labour Party and become MPs that way. And they just maybe don't have the understanding of public service that you would have got if you'd done 30 years working as a doctor or a nurse. Or
I think that's absolutely true. They haven't admitted to that. So let's go on to Dick.
Well, I recognise what you're describing, but rather like Richard, I felt you're stronger on describing what has happened and less on why it's happened. And so I'll offer one contribution to why. Because, and it came when you talked about heroes and villains, and I recognise the villains much more than I recognise the villains now, than I recognise the heroes of then. You know, it's always dangerous to say what we thought or what we felt years ago, but to the extent that I do, I don't think it was so much heroes with public service. I think it was more about respect. I think people, you know, in those sorts of jobs were accorded respect rather than sort of the admiration or hero worship. And one of the things that has happened over the last 50 years has been a challenge to authority. I mean, we're all brought up, our children are brought up, and we were brought up with a quite different attitude to authority to our parents. Our parents were brought up with where you respected figures of authority because they were in authority. And the trend of the last few years has been to change that, and we are all brought up to challenge and to question, and people shouldn't deserve the respect because of the position they got. I don't think that explains the social worker thing, because I think that's a different, I think there's something different going on there.
I don't think it hasn't changed. I agree with some of that. And that's something I think you'll find quite overwhelming, is how much, though, people still are dedicated to the common good. I mean, I don't know what your own children, but an awful lot of my friends' children are working for one sort or other, the public service, and quite a lot of them could have earned a lot more money. That still goes on, and they still like their work very much. So that's, I suppose, one common theme. I agree with you about that.
Yeah, but Dan is right. My children too. But Dan is right. They do it almost not apologetically, but they know that in their milieu of their friends,
Yeah.
you know, working for the public secretary, you know, is almost a foolish thing to do. Certainly financially foolish.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of time explaining to people I work for the Camden New Journal, and the Guardian, or the Times, or the Daily Telegraph. People seem to think, this is just the personal example I can think of, okay, so this might not be true right across the board, but in journalism nowadays, if you want to make 70, 80, £100,000 a year and have your name in lights, you go work for a national newspaper. 30 years ago that wasn't the case. You went and worked for your local paper, and you got people who were happy to stay in their local paper because they had a wide range of things you had to write about. You went and met your readers. You felt that if you wrote something wrong, you might bump into them in the street. They had your phone number. You went out of your office. When I worked at the Daily Mirror, I used to go and sit on the 22nd floor of Canary Wharf, and I didn't leave my desk. And I had no relationship with my readership.
No accountability.
No accountability. I never met any of the people I was supposedly interviewing. Occasionally I'd go to a press conference with 100 other journalists. And the other journalists of my age who I speak to work on the national say, oh, you can come and get a job with us. And it's purely about the kudos and the money, instead of the fact that they actually maybe, when they were 18, thought, I want to be a journalist because I wanted to be very good in that warhead.
But also you wanted the common good, I suspect.
Exactly.
Now, mine is next.
Managerialism, I want to make a point about language.
Yes.
I mean, if we as a public, don't question things more, we don't know what on earth they're talking about. There's all these abstract nouns. Dan's been talking about individuals. We don't hear about people doing jobs. We hear about isms and as you say. And some of this are very obscure, and you read it, it sort of wafts over you. I can't read philosophy. For me, it's like when I try and read philosophy, my mind just goes blank.
Why do so many people in organisations, I don't know which organisation, actually lap this up, even though I don't think they understand it either.
No, they don't.
And yeah, that's another question I haven't quite got to the answer. Is it an age thing? Is it that we all know that we're allowed to say, I don't understand this, it doesn't seem to mean much, and I don't want to, is it that we're more confident, older people are?
But look at the language that you read out from Barnet about New Barnet or One Barnet. That is like, it's like George Orwell, is it?
It's terrifying.
It's absolutely terrifying.
It's absolutely terrifying.
Okay, I think we'll have two more questions. I think a husband and wife here, actually.
Mine is slightly different from what's been asked already on what you've discussed.
Yeah.
I think that newspapers are more kindly towards the educational public sector than they are to some of the others. And even teachers' strikes can get some fairly sympathetic comment. And yet, in a way, the education at the moment, which is undergoing worse gobbledygook, more change for the sake of change, really terrifying, should be at the top end of any newspaper's agenda in criticism.
I think I mentioned that. I'm very worried. The NHS has got many more protectors.
Yes.
The university sector
Yes.
has opened something called, I've actually joined up because one of the support, a friend who has been helping them quite a lot with the book has started an organisation called the Campaign for the Defence of British Universities. Again, they've got a bit of a lobby, but the school lobby is not supported.
It's terrifying, actually. It has to go subject by subject. So, for example, which is of interest to me, the historians are campaigning very strongly against the fact that primary school teachers will now be responsible for teaching all the history of Britain up to the end of the 17th century. And they are not competent to do so, nor do they wish to do so, nor do they have time to do so.
They won't go back for
And
training.
the secondary teachers will only begin teaching history from the Industrial Revolution onwards. Now this is just, it's beyond belief.
And have you noticed that
Horrifyingly
have
arbitrary.
you noticed that in many areas of public service, including mine, certainly until recently, people have actually wanted to stay on beyond 60. For a while they weren't allowed to, now they are. You rarely get a teacher who can cope. By 60 they're exhausted with the pressure
I agree, and
with
there's
the
another
paperwork
point.
and the lack of trust.
Yeah. And they're going to be allowed, as of now, and I can see we have a bulge, we're in a bulge at the moment, to have classes of over 30. They can now go above over 30 and there's no restriction applied at all. I mean, it can go up as far as 40 very probably, because that's, there's no opportunity for any other alternative or extra study.
Just an aside about the sort of idea of protecting teachers. as opposed to protecting other public servants. I was speaking to a picture editor working for a right-wing broadsheet who said their editor never allows them to print pictures of nurses on picket lines in their uniforms because something intrinsically makes you think of Florence Nightingale, makes you think you're on their side, and so it goes against the newspaper's policy. Whereas the Guardian, if the RCN do say anything, they'll get pictures of people in uniforms which the public can easily identify going into their sprint conference, and you'll feel a sympathy towards them. Which
The teachers aren't identifiable.
Teachers
No.
aren't.
Colin, the last word.
Well, I was only going to say that I think this has been happening for 100 years. The fact is that the public, all of us are to blame, because bad news sells newspapers and good news is boring.
But isn't it?
I think we could all discuss newspapers all day.
And
Yeah, well, I mean, Penny Dreadfuls are always about that. It's not a new thing. It's still
and as far as public service, why that gets criticism and private sector doesn't, is because we, the public, again, think we're paying for it. And that's why we object. And so there's somehow, I don't know how you correct that balance, but it's a balance which has got to be.
Except that we've been paying for private consultants and privatisation is costing. You know, there is
in the long term.
Yes.
Pendulum has to swing.
Sorry,
Okay, I have been saying last question. In order to have a quiet life when I want things done at the community centre, I'm going to let Mick have the last one.
It's more of a question for Darren. It's just about the unions. And a long time ago, when I lived up north, I was a fireman. I was a part of the union there, and I lived up there when all the miners stuff was going on with Scargill and Thatcher and everything else. So very pro-unions all the way through. But obviously somebody like Scargill didn't have, I think they had a very good strategy with all of this. And you were talking about Bob Crow. And I was just wondering, you know, I think you hear stories about, you know, he's defending people who broke their ankle, yet to go and play squash, and you know, all that sort of stuff, which is the stuff you were talking about that the press pick up on.
Yeah.
But I'm just wondering, you know,
I'd have to say, right, that having looked at the archive stuff about Bob Crow, spoken to his press officer, that I would take absolutely every single thing I read about him, the most gigantic, not a pinch of salt, with a shovel full. Right? They wrote a story that I think it was the Mail, might have been the Express. It's in the book. It was the Mail. Wrote a piece saying Bob Crow was living in a housing association flat, paying 50 quid a week rent and earning £120,000 a year. It was a lie. He took them to court. He won. The court said you must print an apology. It was that small. It was one sentence that was buried on page 48. The story had been on the front page of their newspaper. Anything I read about him, I really would read between the lines. I'm not here to defend Bob Crow. His politics might be different from others. The thing is, we should hold him to account properly. There is something about creating the bogeyman which is very easy for the readers to understand and simplify, and that's one of the problems with how the press report the public sector.
I think we're very lucky that Dan does journalism on evidence-based. And I really want to thank Jenny and Dan. I mean, it's been the most unusual. It's been very enlightening, and the book sounds fascinating. I mean, I don't know how Jenny stood in the footprints of all the contributors and thought her way through it, but it seems fascinating. And in the usual way of Primrose Hill, we'd like to...
That's very soon.